You call me Mario and Sonic the way when I see a girl, I'm on it. Hey everybody, what's up? Welcome back to the Gamescades. Today, and only today, we are here to talk about an age-old discussion, an age-old, war that has been waged for over 30 years now, and that is Mario versus Sonic, right? This is a question that, has come up throughout the lives of these two's, career, and I think, now that we're like 35 years in, basically, right? Because Sonic's celebrating 35 years. Now that we are 35 years in to this debate and conversation, I figured I'd talk about, where is this conversation at? Is it still relevant? Why were these two clashing in the first place? When did things maybe shift? And yeah, let's get right into it. But of course, if you enjoy the content, please consider subscribing to your boy. We're nearing 100K on YouTube this year. This is the goal I want to achieve. I stream over here on YouTube and Twitch every day, and I make videos all the time for you, so lock in for me. So, Mario versus Sonic. Obviously, Mario debuting in 85, Sonic debuting in 91. And obviously, I don't need to go over the entire history of what happened back in the 90s. Sonic was effectively created, and it was Sega's competitor to Mario. Now, I would say, if we're being realistic, like we're talking about this, the real time it was a genuine war was in the 90s, right? In the 90s was truly the time where Mario versus Sonic was a peak argument, to the point where Sega would try to sabotage Nintendo, right? There's that old picture that floats around on Nintendo out of a Sonic hanging on a rope. I don't know if that's real or not, but regardless, from interviews and documentaries and everything, it was very clear that the Sega versus Nintendo war that was happening in the 90s was pretty bad. Obviously, it's not a war, there's no weapons and stuff. This is business at the end of the day, but they would try to sabotage each other. There was a lot of back and forth in terms of how these products were fought against, and obviously, if we look back just ourselves, right, comparing Mario 1 to Sonic 1, I feel like already is pretty interesting, right? You have Mario 1, which is one of the most iconic video games of all time. You know the drill, you know the wave. It saved gaming, yada yada, simple to get into. You can still play it today and have a good time. But Sonic 1, I feel like, funny enough, is a game that's aged a little less better, but it had this style, right? It was oh, whoa, this feels cool, right? And that was always, to this day, right, Sonic's extra point that he's always had, or tried to always have, over Mario is hey, this is cool, right? This is a cool platformer, and it is way more comparable to Mario 1 and Sonic 1 in terms of what kind of game they are, because at the end of the day, both games are run and jump, right? Obviously their functions are different. With Sonic, you're hopping on an enemy just to get you get a little bounce unless you hold it and you get air. With Sonic, you're going with momentum. But even in Mario 1, there is a lot of momentum based movement. I mean, you are running, you try to get those big jumps, even if you let go of the jump and you continue to move. There is a flow to the movement in that game, right? But again, what made these two really fight early on is that they are both really similar in terms of what they were gameplay wise. They were 2D platformers first and foremost, right? Not counting spin-offs and stuff, which both of them end up getting, right? But that's really where it came down to, is that Sonic was a speed-based platformer that was super cool, right, and had a style to it. It was a little bit harder to get into, or maybe more hard to play, right? Whereas Mario was always hey, this is fun, this is safe, but platforming is perfected, right? It's very rare that something, is wrong here, right? Everything flows incredibly well. Whereas with Sonic, there was always something that felt weird about it, right? But it was that coolness and learning it and showing someone look at all this cool shit I could do from a loop-de-loop into a jump into this area, right? That put it apart. And I would argue, right, and I've talked about this throughout my career doing this, if you now looking back, right, at the original trilogy run, or quadrilogy run, I guess, of Mario games, right? Because you would go Mario 1, 2, 3, and World versus Sonic 1, 2, 3, and CD, right? I would argue it's pretty close, right? Because if you think about it, Mario 1 versus Sonic 1, Mario 1, I would say takes over it. I think overall, if you're talking about impact on the industry, Sonic 2 versus Mario 2, I think Sonic 2 takes that no question. Sonic takes that. I mean, Mario 2 was a weird game that obviously people did you know that it was Doki Doki in Japan? But I think Sonic 2 is one of the best 2D platformers out there, right? And then you get Mario 3 versus Sonic 3 and Knuckles, which is I think you could argue that. I mean, obviously there are people that think Mario 3 is legendary, but there's people that think Sonic 3 is legendary. So that's an arguable one. And then you get like something like a CD versus a World where, you know, you could get a little weird. I guess technically you could say Sonic CD is the comparison to Mario World. So if you thought about it like that, where it's like Mario 1 versus Sonic 1, Sonic CD versus Mario 2, Mario 3 versus, what's it called? Mario 3 versus, who would it be? I guess Sonic 2. And then Sonic 3 and Knuckles is versus Mario World, then I guess it's a little bit more of a comparable conversation, right? But in my opinion, right, here's where I feel like things shift funny enough, right, which is hilarious. I think the shift to 3D, right, you know, the rough transition, whatever you want to call it, I think that is when, to me, the conversation started getting a little less logical and more from a like fanboy perspective, right? So obviously you get a game like Mario 64 that comes out, game changer to this day is sped run, right? It's all about the movement, right? It's a pure 3D platformer, all movement based, you know what I mean? And it's like, it's still Mario to the core. Obviously, you know, it's changed everything. You know, we're in 3D now, you know, you're doing your backflips, your dives and everything, right? But I guess with that game, everything still kind of stayed very Mario, right? Whereas Sonic Adventure, I feel like really changed what Sonic is, right? Because you get into this 3D space, right? And already, you know, Sonic has always been its own different challenge where it is like a fast-paced platformer. So making that speed into a 3D, you know, platformer was much more challenging. But then you get to a game like Sonic Adventure where, okay, Sonic's levels, you know, in gameplay, you could still argue are very Mario, right? Where it is, you are still effectively jumping and running, right, around the areas. Obviously, with Sonic, you're doing it at a much faster degree, and the levels go by a bit faster. But, you know, you could argue that, right? But then, like, when it comes to Sonic Adventure, like, you have 5 different like characters you can play as, right? Like, you get Knuckles, where like the game is a treasure hunting level. You get Amy, where like platforming is a little bit different. You're hitting this hammer, you're going around. You have the big fishing mini games. You have Tails, which is still technically platforming, but, you know, a little bit different. And I already start to see that shift, right, when it comes to Sonic Adventure versus Mario 64. Now, granted, I do think this is still within the area of like, hey, these are kind of similar, because, you know, I guess you could equate the treasure hunting levels in Knuckles to, like, you know, getting the 8 red coins in Mario 64, right? The, you know, big fishing levels, well, you know, it's not the same. You know, there's some areas in Mario 64 that are underwater. Now, obviously, you know, fishing and swimming are very different things, but you know what I mean, right? Or like, for example, in Mario, you're getting different abilities, right? You could argue that Gamma, in a way, is an ability, right? Where you are like platforming, but attacking enemies the same way you would get a power-up in Mario 64. But funny, Mario 64 doesn't really have a lot of power-ups, right? It's what? It's the wing cap, it's the metal cap, right? And then it's the invisible cap. There's not a lot of attack-based weapons and abilities in Mario 64. But regardless, I do think that when it comes to that early era, right, of like Mario 64 versus Sonic Adventure, you could still make an argument of like, hey, these two are like competing platformers, right? They're still pretty similar in vein, right? Except, you know, Sonic then leans into story more, which I think is the big game changer, right? Like, that is really the start of it, you know, because obviously, you know, all the platformers in some way tell a story, right? Sonic 3 and Knuckles kind of starts telling a story, you know, by those ending level sprite animations that, you know, transition to the next levels, or, you know, you have Knuckles laughing or trying to ruin the day for Sonic. Like, you have some environmental storytelling, but Sonic Adventure, I mean, changes everything. It gives these characters voices, right? There is whole ass cutscenes between not just Sonic, but all of his friends. You are leading everything up into this like final supersonic battle. Like, that is the start, I feel, of everything changes, because from this point forward, 3D Sonic is now not just a platformer, but it is a story video game too. You know, like, it is a game where like the story is now a factor for 3D Sonic. This is now something that, you know, when reviews are talking about it and going over it, like, this is something you need to factor because you're getting a lot of these cutscenes. And that alone, I feel like, changes so much already between the conversation, because to this day, right, you know, and we'll get to games like Galaxy and stuff, I think there is some notion of, you know, Mario games having a bit of a story, right? And you could kind of see then in the next game we'll talk about with Sunshine, right? But at the end of the day, what do you always see with Mario? With Mario, everyone's like, with Mario, no one cares about the story. It's about the gameplay. The story is extra. The story is great to have, right? It's nice that, for example, Galaxy has this grandiose, you know, theme in space and some cool story, you know, tellings, right? But at the end of the day, like, it's not a narrative game. You're not getting a cutscene every other level you're beating in Mario Galaxy. It's effectively, you know, you get your first cutscene, you get the last one, right? And then maybe like a middle one in between of characters yapping and stuff, right? So right away, when Sonic Adventure hits, we've shifted a narrative gameplay experience versus just a pure gameplay experience. Now, you get to a game like Sonic Adventure 2 versus Mario Sunshine, right? Where again, like we've already kind of shifted. And things are, again, vastly different here, which is, it's funny because I've said this before, like, Adventure 2 and Sunshine are super similar games, right? Where I think a lot of people that love these games that grew up with them understand that, you know, they're a little bit janky, right? You know, like mech levels and emerald hunting levels versus stuff like, you know, pachinko machines, unfinished Sunshine levels, like slippery controls. Like, there's a lot of comparisons between Adventure 2 and Sunshine. But again, this is another moment where I feel like things are truly shifting between the two, because we already have the narrative difference, right, between Sonic and Mario at this point. But now we have, like, you know, mech gameplay levels, which like are super different. Now, granted, Flood is technically a weapon of sorts. You know, obviously it's not comparable to a mech, but it's in the same vein. So again, it is still this conversation. They are still these early 2000s platformers, and there's still a bit of a debate / conversation between them, right? It's getting fainter, as I can tell and as you can see, right? Because they are still, you know, trying to aim for the same thing. But I will say, like, in Sonic Adventure 2, like, the movement, especially on Sonic, like, if you were to compare, like, if you put side by side, right, you know, if you put side by side City Escape versus what's like the first level of Mario Sunshine, it's like the what's that level? It's PD Piranha's Shift or whatever it's called, right? If you were like put those levels side by side, right, the type of platforming you're doing and movement is completely different. I mean, Sonic levels are starting to feel like set pieces, right? Like when you get to a Sonic level in Sonic Adventure, this is like a moment. It's a set piece. You know, you're in there 2 to 3 minutes, right? Whereas with Mario Sunshine, you are like meticulous platforming. You're slowly, you know, trying to get to the shine. Sometimes you'll encounter a boss in the middle of the level. Sometimes you're getting lost in the level. Like, they're starting to introduce these open levels, right? You could do some of these stars or shines out of order, right? You could be in a mission trying to go get the 8 red coins. You could be trying to get the 100 coins in there. Like, you're trying to get blue coins. Like, they sort of open up this idea of exploration a little bit in this game, right? Whereas, again, in a game like Mario, Sonic Adventure 2, everything is speed-based, right? You know, you get the Knuckles levels, which is your form of exploring, right? Because I think Sonic and Tails levels are effectively super linear, whereas, you know, you get to the Knuckles levels or the Rouge levels, and those are your exploration levels. Those are your, like, hey, let's look around, let's find things. But you can't do things out of order in Sonic Adventure 2. You are still following a linear path that you have to go through, whereas there's a bit of agency in a game like Mario Sunshine. But again, effectively, we are still dealing at this point with, like, we're still dealing with the argument of Sonic versus Mario at this point. And, you know, these series have both spun off at this point, right? Like with Mario, funny enough, on the 2D side, Mario kind of died for a while in the 2000s, whereas Sonic kept going with 2D, funny enough, right? Like, you know, Sonic evolved in 2D. They started getting these Sonic Rush games, right? Where you got Sonic Rush and Rush Adventure. Now, granted, on the DS, actually, you could kind of argue they went through the same thing now that I think about it, because they had the original 4 2D platformers, and then what was the next 2D Sonic game that was really like a big deal? It was Sonic Rush. In the same way, there was New Super Mario Bros. DS. And again, you could argue that that's even when the shift in 2D games kind of started happening, because, like, if you look at the New Super Mario Bros. Games, they are still effectively old 2D Mario, just maybe a little bit floatier and a little bit, you know, zoomed out. Whereas Sonic Rush, like, is not how classic Sonic plays at all, right? They are speed-based, right? You have this boost gauge, you're trying to do air tricks in the air, you can combo into enemies. Like, it's a whole different ball game in terms of how you play those games. So already, like, we see a shift in how 2D gets into, right? It moves out of its own, it moves to its own direction, right? To the point where, like, Sonic Rush Adventure, like, you're resource managing, you're replaying levels, you're going in these battle tanks to try to get, you know, resources, you're replaying levels to get these stuff, you're upgrading your island. Like, it's so different to how a new Super Mario Bros. Plays, right? And again, even Sega, when Sega tried to reattempt 2D games with, you know, stuff like Sonic 4, Sonic 4 Episode 2, and even Sonic Superstars, they were never really able to recapture that, like, comparison between the two. Again, you know, I feel like the comparison on the 2D side for Mario and Sonic kind of ended after the original Quad trilogy of games, right? Because again, like, I feel like it's no question that a game like Mario Wonder is a little bit, you know, some people would argue, like, I think it's better than Sonic Superstars, right? But again, it's funny because that's the closest you get to comparing them again, right? But it did feel like with Nintendo with 2D Mario, they kind of kept evolving it, whether it was a Mario Maker, you know, or it was new Super Mario Bros. Games or whatever. They tried to keep continuing it, whereas, like, Sonic kind of, you know, went off on its own path. I don't know. It felt like things shifted away there, right? And then obviously back to the 3D games argument that I was having before, right? Is the adventure games and Heroes, it's kind of where it ends. I think, like, once you start getting into the Heroes territory and Shadow the Hedgehog territory, I mean, what the fuck are you even comparing next to Mario? No, I don't mean in a quality way, but like gameplay wise, because, like, you know, in a game like Sonic Heroes, that's a mainline Sonic game, you have 4 different campaigns, right? You still have these speed-based platforming levels, but it becomes more of an action game. You have 3 different movesets, you know, between the 3 characters. You're getting character upgrades in combat, right? You're trying to get to the big finale story. Shadow the Hedgehog is like a action 3D platformer. You've got guns, you've got weapons, right? And at this point, right, like, we're at the same time, Sonic Adventure 2 versus Sunshine is the last 3D argument until Galaxy, right? Because Mario takes effectively a long break between, you know, Sunshine and Galaxy. I think it's a 5-year gap, 4 or 5-year gap, but Sonic kept going at that point, right? And then the next argument that comes up is a game like Super Mario Galaxy versus, you know, Sonic Unleashed, which to me, I'm like, all right, we have completely moved away from what the hell are the comparisons between these two, because Mario Galaxy effectively becomes this, like, unique take on a 3D platformer, right, with these, like, anti-gravity mechanics, right, like, but it's still meticulous 3D platforming. Sonic Unleashed, the boost formula, I think changed everything in terms of the conversation, because when we were talking about the early comparisons, right, we could say, like, okay, they're still, like, effectively, you know, 3D platformers, you know, Sonic's got more speed, but they're doing the same thing. Dude, like, I want you to look side by side here of a Galaxy level, you know, versus a Unleashed level, right? This is crazy. These are not the same thing at all anymore. These are completely different types of games, right? And especially, like, you go through a boost level, it's basically a reaction-based platformer, and that's kind of what Sonic ended up shifting to. It becomes a reaction-based platformer, at least in the boost era, right? In the boost era of 3D Sonic, they became their own thing, right? If you compare Mario Galaxy 1 and 2 to, you know, a Sonic Unleashed / Sonic Colors / Sonic Generations, right? They're like, you're talking about a reaction-based platformer that's all about speed, keeping your speed up, trying to get through every enemy as quick as possible, you know, versus Galaxy and Galaxy 2, which, you know, slower pace, more, you know, about the overall movement and level design, right? Whereas Sonic was like balls to the walls, and you're like, dude, Sonic Unleashed has a whole action game in it, right? The Werehog is effectively an action game. Like, it's effectively like Devil May Cry style, you know, walking through levels, enemy hordes, upgrade systems. You can level up Sonic a bunch. You can level up the Werehog a bunch. Like, it's so different, right? And then, like, that's where I felt that was funny enough. Like, this is when I stopped the conversation, at least in terms of caring. Because when I was younger, and I think we all have this, and to this day, there's a bit of a competitive drive. And well, I'll talk about, how that still sticks with you as a gamer and, player of these games. But there's always been this sort of thrive in like conversation of debating them, right? People like debating these games, but I stopped being able to like have a debate about it once you get to this modern era. Because again, it's like, what am I doing when I'm comparing Sonic Unleashed to Mario Galaxy? For me, like as someone who adores both of them, they're so different for me. I love them both for completely different reasons, right? Which technically you could argue that with every game, but they're so, even in terms of their gameplay, like, I don't know, to this day, I can compare Astro Bot, right, which is a modern 3D platformer. I could compare that to Mario Galaxy because they still feel, they're still in the same vein of like a, flat lands, right, 3D platformer, fight some enemies, being a boom bomb, you're at the end with some gimmick levels thrown in there, right? It's super different, whereas even like a game like Sonic Frontiers, it's not that similar to Astro Bot, right? Astro Bot is still a linear platformer. I'm moving on, obviously. I'm moving the goalposts here. But my point is to say that I really do think when we got to that Wii era, PS3 era for, Sonic versus Mario, I feel like everything, changed. And obviously you had the change in conversation overall, sadly, because Sonic 06 happened. Like, dude, could you imagine the fucking dire state that the world was like? Dude, I watch it. Obviously, we all know how Sonic 06 turned out. But dude, a year after Sonic 06, Mario Galaxy comes out. It's painful. You know what I mean? Like, that was a big moment where like, all right, like that, now this isn't even a conversation anymore. Like, Mario is just better. That seeping argument from the 90s, right? That kept creeping back up of Mario versus Sonic gets sprung up now because 06 is dick, and then the next year you're getting one of the best platformers of all time to this day. Mario Galaxy comes out, and it's like a whoa, like what are we even doing? Like, oh, Sonic could never be like this or whatever. Now people forget. I'm like, in my mind, I was thinking about it, I'm like, damn, Sonic quality wise, obviously should be like this, but they didn't want to be like this. You know what I mean? Like 06, had it been done, incredible ambition, unique gameplay, would be more akin to what Galaxy is, right? Where you're getting these like main levels that you're going through, you play them again. The same way you have different missions in Mario where you go back to a galaxy. That's sort of how Sonic 06 is, when Shadows goes back to a level that Sonic does or Silver does, but you play them very differently and you have different mission structures. But yeah, it's hysterical when you think about it in that way of like, if 06 was, an incredible game, I still think the conversation would be pretty similar, even if the games are veering off, right? Like Sonic has always been priding itself at this point at swapping characters. Its cast was really important. That's why something like, Sonic Adventure 2 means so much to people, because even if it's flawed or weird gameplay wise, I mean, everybody adores Shadow the Hedgehog. They love the story of, Shadow and Maria. They love the story of Sonic versus Shadow, right? They love the banter between Knuckles and Rouge. People at this point are falling in love with Sonic's characters, which, with Mario characters, and I know there's the spin-offs and the RPGs, but I think for the most part, everyone's just like, I love this character because I love just playing as them. Like Peach is super cute. I love Princess Peach. I love Mario. He's like a cool hero, right? Like that's a cool dude. Luigi, oh, he's funny, he's cute, he's scared, right? Right? But it's like with Tails and Sonic and Rouge and Knuckles at this point, you're finding out lore about these characters. Tails got trauma on his back. Knuckles has lost his entire tribe. Like, my man's going through it. That's why I feel like so many people fell in love with Rosalina, right? Because Rosalina felt like the closest thing you're ever going to get to a Mario character getting some sort of backstory, right? A narrative tied to them, right? That's why people are falling in love with Pauline now, right? Because, Pauline, you see Kid Pauline in DK Bonanza, and then when you see the older Pauline in the games, you're like, oh man, like there's a narrative thread I can sort of tie to this character, right? But like I said, when you get to this 3D era of the, Boost formula versus Galaxy, things have completely shifted. And then obviously it did not help the 2010s era of Sonic, where things kind of went downhill. And in fact, honestly, things kind of shifted when Sonic tried to be like Mario. You know what I mean? Like, people always make fun of Sonic Lost World, especially for being a a Galaxy game, right? It tries to do like the small platforms that you jump to the next one and you jump to the next one. It's hysterical how much Sonic Lost World wants to be like Super Mario Galaxy and how much it kind of tries to take an inspiration from that. And even though, like, you know, there is Sonicisms in it, like, you know, there's the parkour system or some of the speed-based levels, it still is very much trying to be a Galaxy game, which makes sense. You know, Galaxy 1 and 2 were still fresh on the mind. Then Sonic and Sega had this deal that they were working with Nintendo to have exclusive games on the Wii U, which, funny enough, kind of screwed them in the long run, right? And at this point, also, like, the rivalry has also especially died down because we've had Mario and Sonic Olympic Games, right, where these two have, like, finally come together. I'll never forget when I got Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Games, and I was mind blown. I was like, dude, they're together. Like, my characters that I grew up with, fell in love with, are like together now. You know, they're friends, they're homies, you know. And even when Sonic got into Brawl, right, and is now pretty much a mainstay of Smash, right? He got into Brawl, he got into Smash 4, he got into Smash Ultimate. Like, it's been very much no question that Sonic felt like he's part of the family. And, you know, during that 2010s era, it felt like, I think, like, the war ended there. You know, I think for me, I was just kind of like, well, these guys are kind of buddies now, you know. And I think these franchises are so different that this conversation point is almost not irrelevant, but it's kind of just a relic of the past. People just kind of have the debate because it's fun to do, right? And people just like, you know, Sonic versus Mario fights, right? Or they like, oh, I love comparing these old games, you know. But effectively, like, when you get to now, things are super different. Now, I will say a big caveat is the conversation, I feel like, has returned to its spark, right, ever since Frontiers, right? I think after Lost World and Forces, it felt like Sonic was so devoid of what it was, and it was so different, whereas Mario, even Mario, to be fair, wasn't really evolving too much. I mean, you got a game like 3D World and 3D Land, which was like, you know, sterile 3D Mario, but it was still like a quality product, as opposed to a Forces and a Lost World there, which are kind of, you know, a little bit more middling, even though Mario wasn't going for ambition there. It was the 2010s was just so super weird. But now you get into effectively that territory of like, all right, a game like Super Mario Odyssey comes out the same year as Sonic Forces, which makes things look awful. You know what I mean? Like, again, like, it's the same thing that happened in 06, where like 06 isn't a disaster. It is a disaster, but like Forces isn't a disaster, but it's such a black game. You get that versus like a game like Odyssey that comes out and things just, it gets worse. It feels like everything is worse. But now, right, things have changed, right? You get a game like Sonic Frontiers, right? Where, again, Sonic Frontiers is nothing like Odyssey. The only thing I feel like it shares with Odyssey is the open platforming. But Sonic has a full combat system. He has a full RPG level up system effectively in the game. You are getting these unbelievably cinematic boss fights, right? You are getting, you know, still the boost levels in there. Like, Sonic Frontiers is its own league. I'm not necessarily, again, talking about in quality in terms of what the fuck it is versus Odyssey, which is like a simple, fun 3D collectathon, right? Whereas Sonic, you know, Frontiers is that. You are still collecting things in an environment. You're still collecting keys, right? You're collecting the hearts. You're collecting the memories. You're collecting things, you know, to get ultimately to the final boss. But the way you are playing and interacting with these games is so different. You're getting like a sad story that relies on you knowing about the past. You're reflecting on the past with these characters. You're getting these narrative beats. I don't know, man. Like, even the environments are a little bit more darker. Whereas Odyssey was like colors, 3D platforming, fun, go have fun, the world is beautiful, right? Whereas Sonic Frontiers, you know, it's a little bit more mood down, hype up, action, like over mega boss fights, like all this kind of stuff that like changes everything for the series, as well as the movies, right? Now, the movies are another conversation that came up here to just kind of spark everything, right? Because again, it's easy to have a debate between these two, but they're also super different. I mean, Sonic the movies are these 3D live action, you know, movies with Sonic CG in them. Mario went with the animated route, and people compare these movies all the time, and I'm like, again, like, these movies to me are super different. With Mario, I feel like I'm getting a less story-based movie. If anything, that's a lot of people's complaint about the Mario movies. The story's kind of whatever, but it's gorgeous, right? It's gorgeous. The music is fantastic. It's super respective of the source material, right? Whereas like with the Sonic movies, they're sort of weaving these game stories into, you know, these live action set pieces with the humans. You know, they're trying to retell stories. Like Sonic Adventure 2 is what Sonic Movie 3 is, and Sonic Movie 2 is Sonic 2 and 3, you know, the old games combined. It's just weird, you know. It's super different, and I love the movie comparisons because I feel like it drives a competitive nature. And that's, I guess, the biggest point I wanted to get to, right, is Mario versus Sonic is a debate about quality over a true, like, hey, I can compare these games 1-to-1, you know, because again, I feel like I can fairly compare a game like, you know, Astrobot or a Crash Bandicoot to a Mario Odyssey or a Mario Galaxy, not necessarily because of their quality, because they're super simple, like they're super similar in their gameplay. Whereas like I have struggles comparing like my thoughts on a game like Galaxy versus like Sonic Generations because they're so different, right? Or, you know, or a 3D World, I guess, versus Sonic versus Sonic X Shadow Generations. Like they're just so different in terms of what they are. It's like I can have a preference, but the way I interact with them is completely different. And the only thing that I still think holds Mario versus Sonic as a conversation point is the drive, right? The drive for these two to be, you know, comparable. And what I mean by comparable is like people want to say that Sonic is better than Mario, right? And people want to say that Mario is better than Sonic. And for a long time, you know, because of problems at Sega, there was a big era where like, you know, Mario did feel better than Sonic, right? But Sonic is not just carried by its games, it's carried by its fans, it's carried by its passion, right? There is like incredible sprite animation. Now I know there's incredible projects that go on with Mario, of course, there's a lot of great fan projects there. Mario 64, you know, ROM hacks and 64 co-op and, you know, Galaxy mods. There's incredible mods that happen in the Nintendo scene, but with Sonic, it's on another level. You're getting, you know, Sonic hacking contests to promote like all sorts of Sonic mods. You're getting, you know, Sonic mods, Sonic fan games, left, right, up and down constantly. And, you know, Sonic Generations is a game that thrives off its mods. Like, it's so different how these worlds are interacting. You know, Sonic is cool, and that super carries everything for Sonic. That cool factor, that energy that people have, that spark people have for Sonic comes from one-upping, wanting to one-up what is sort of like a more corporate, like Mario is corporate and not in a bad way, right? It's just that like Mario is like that guy in your class that was always like the best, right? Like he was getting the best grades, you know, he was well beloved, right? And then you get Sonic, who's like, he's so fucking cool, right? But people keep looking at that guy because he's like the golden, he's the status quo, he's the one everybody wants to be, you know, that's the golden hero. It's funny, like it's almost like Goku and Vegeta almost. We're like, yeah, Vegeta loses his fights, you know, more than Goku, but people love Vegeta. People find Vegeta super cool. People want Vegeta to thrive. And when Vegeta does thrive and he does cool shit and he goes Super Saiyan 3 or he goes Majin Vegeta and he's raw as hell, right? Or he's trying his best, it stands out so much to people, right? But in the same way in Dragon Ball Super, Vegeta has gone Ultra Ego, Goku has gone UI, they've gone their separate paths. And that's how I feel about Mario and Sonic as, you know, series. Is I feel like besides 2D games, right, which are more similar, I feel like in their big mainline releases, these two have completely moved on from a more close competitive nature, and I feel like it moved on a long time ago, but again, people are still holding on to the conversation because of their love of the series, you know, and them wanting to strive for that, like, I want to be as good as that guy. To this day, I mean, even Sega themselves saying it, right? It's like they've said they want to challenge themselves to be on the level of Mario. You know what I mean? That's a challenge for them. And I will always respect something or, you know, a drive to be better than someone because it's a challenge, not because you want to take the other one down, or you want the other person to fail. That's bad competitive drive. When I see people online be like comparing, gameplay things and making fun of another thing, yada yada, I'm always like, that's kind of lame, right? We should strive this to be a competitive conversation because we want these two to thrive in their own ways, and see that battle, and that's really where it comes down to for me. So guys, let me know in the comments below what you think about this conversation. Do you still compare these characters and series super closely? Do you agree that things have completely shifted? Let me know what you all think down below, and of course, I'll see you all next time. Peace out.